In exactly 47 seconds, one simple question would expose the biggest lie in American economic policy. I watched from my Federal Reserve office as Congressman Mark Pocan cornered Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent with 5 words that no administration official wanted to answer honestly. What happened next revealed everything wrong with how this country talks about money. 5 words. Who pays tariffs, Mr. Secretary? You might think that's basic economics. Every Fed chair since Volcker could answer it instantly. But I knew what Bessent was thinking as Pocan pressed him. The truth would destroy months of carefully constructed messaging. I've sat through hundreds of congressional hearings, watched politicians dance around difficult questions, but this was different. This was a moment when political theater crashed into mathematical reality, and reality won. Bessent couldn't answer because the answer exposes everything. Tariffs aren't paid by foreign countries. They're not magical wealth generators. They're taxes on American families, collected at the border and passed down until they hit kitchen table budgets. But here's what made Pocan's questioning devastating. He wasn't some academic economist throwing around theories. He owned a small business. He understood invoices, payroll, and the brutal arithmetic of thin profit margins. I just got a tariff surcharge from one of my suppliers, Pocan said, his voice cutting through Bessent's evasions. And guess what else got raised? American-made walnut plaques. That has nothing to do with tariffs, but companies take advantage. That line hit me like cold water. As Fed chair, I track economic ripple effects daily, but Pocan captured something my models struggle with: how chaos creates cover for price gouging. When tariffs are unpredictable, every price increase becomes defensible. Bessent kept deflecting, talking about strategic uncertainty and complicated mixes. I recognize the language. It's what we use when we can't defend our positions with facts. Pocan wasn't having it. Reclaiming my time, he said over and over, reclaiming my time. Each repetition was like watching someone refuse to let truth get buried under bureaucratic doublespeak. Pocan understood what Bessent was avoiding, admitting that tariff policies hurt the exact people they claimed to protect. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Bessent had just returned from investor conferences in Beverly Hills, explaining his crazy Ivan theory to wealthy hedge fund managers. Meanwhile, Pocan described auto shops and specialty printers struggling with supply chain disruptions. Crazy Ivan is great for really rich people like you, Pocan said, but for people like me it's not. That's what makes small businesses fail. I've watched monetary policy debates for decades. Usually both sides at least pretend to care about working families, but this exchange stripped away pretense. One man spoke from boardrooms, the other from Main Street reality. The stock market numbers Pocan cited were accurate. Trump's first 100 days had produced the worst performance since Nixon. But beyond numbers lay human stories: delayed orders, canceled investments, families choosing between groceries and gas. When Bessent finally attempted an answer, calling tariff impacts a complicated mix, Pocan delivered the knockout punch. It's not complicated. Consumers pay Trump's tariff tax. That's the reality. 4 sentences, 31 words, economic truth distilled to its essence. I thought about my own testimony before Congress. How many times had I used complexity as camouflage? Sometimes technical nuance matters, but sometimes officials hide behind complexity to avoid admitting uncomfortable truths. Watching Pocan refuse to let Bessent run out the clock reminded me why honest communication matters in economic policy. When we obscure how policies actually work, we enable bad decisions and protect officials from accountability. The deeper lesson extends beyond tariffs. Every economic policy has winners and losers. Pretending otherwise or hiding costs behind technical language doesn't eliminate those costs. It just shifts them to people with less power to complain. Pocan's persistence exposed something crucial about how Washington discusses economics. Too often we talk to investors while families pay the bills. We theorize about strategic uncertainty while small businesses face very certain bankruptcies. As Fed chair, I try to communicate clearly about monetary policy. But this exchange reminded me that clarity isn't just good practice, it's moral obligation. When economic policies affect millions of Americans, officials owe them honest explanations. Bessent's discomfort was palpable. He knew the answer. Import duties are passed through supply chains like any other cost. Economists have understood this since Adam Smith. But admitting it would undermine months of campaign promises and policy justifications. That's why Pocan's question was so powerful. It forced a choice between political messaging and economic honesty, between investor conference rhetoric and kitchen table reality. The exchange lasted less than 5 minutes, but those 5 minutes revealed how economic policy gets distorted when officials care more about protecting narratives than protecting families. I've seen how monetary policy mistakes can devastate communities, watched housing bubbles destroy neighborhoods, witnessed how abstract economic theories become concrete human suffering when we get things wrong. Pocan understood this connection viscerally. His suppliers were real people. His employees had families. When tariff policies failed, they wouldn't lose conference speaking fees. They'd lose their livelihoods. That's what made his final statement so devastating. After 5 minutes of evasion, bureaucratic language, and attempted deflection, Pocan cut through everything with simple truth. Consumers pay. No qualifiers, no technical caveats, no strategic uncertainty theories, just the mathematical reality that every household experiences but few officials will acknowledge. Watching that exchange reminded me why I chose public service, not to protect comfortable lies or enable profitable delusions, but to help America understand economic reality clearly enough to make better choices. Because when we lie about who pays, working families always end up paying more. I watched C-SPAN replay the exchange that evening. Newsrooms were already spinning it as political theater, missing the deeper story. This wasn't about embarrassing Bessent, it was about breaking Washington's comfortable habit of hiding policy costs behind technical language. At the Fed, we explain complex policy honestly. When we lower rates or expand our balance sheet, we don't pretend costs disappear. We explain who benefits and who might be hurt. Yet here was a Treasury Secretary unable to answer Economics 101. The silence in that hearing room had been deafening, not just from Bessent's evasions, but from every Republican committee member who suddenly found their notepads fascinating. They knew the answer too, they just couldn't afford to admit it. Fed Governor Lael Brainerd had warned me months earlier. The supply chain disruptions are showing up in our regional surveys. Small manufacturers are getting squeezed. Watching Pocan describe those exact pressures, her warnings felt prophetic. Bessent's Beverly Hills conference comment had particularly stung. I'd attended similar events throughout my career, rooms full of portfolio managers discussing positioning around policy uncertainty. But there's a crucial difference between managing risk and creating it deliberately. When Pocan called the strategy "how a monkey throws dung," he captured the lived experience of businesses trying to plan when trade policies shift daily. The Crazy Ivan reference made me wince. Submarine maneuvers aren't economic policy. Random shocks destroy the predictability businesses need. Our latest beige book showed the pattern. Small businesses anxious about trade volatility, some stockpiling inventory, others delaying expansion entirely. Every delayed expansion meant jobs not created. Every canceled order meant struggling families. Pocan's fury wasn't just political positioning. It was the accumulated frustration of constituents watching their economic security evaporate while officials discussed abstract game theory. The disconnect between policy rhetoric and lived reality had become a chasm. I thought about the conversations I'd had with community bankers across the Midwest. They described customers uncertain about business loans, hesitant to commit to major purchases, worried about price inflation eating away at fixed incomes. These weren't ideological concerns, they were practical fears rooted in observable economic changes. The stock market data Pocan cited told its own story. When equity markets perform poorly in a new administration's early months, it usually signals investor uncertainty about policy direction. But stock volatility affects more than portfolio values. It impacts pension funds, retirement accounts, and college savings plans. Watching Bessent squirm under questioning, I realized we were witnessing something historically significant. Not since the 1930s had American trade policy been so explicitly divorced from economic consensus. Even Republican economists privately acknowledged tariffs' regressive impact, but political loyalty demanded public silence. Bessent's bureaucratic evasion was familiar. When confronted with inconvenient facts, officials pivot to complexity, turn clear cause and effect into academic puzzles. But Pocan refused to accept complexity as camouflage. When Bessent finally mumbled about complicated mixes, he was essentially admitting defeat. In economics, when you can't explain who bears costs clearly, you probably don't understand the policy yourself. Or worse, you understand perfectly but lack the courage to explain honestly. The moment crystallized everything wrong with how Washington discusses economic policy in the social media age. Complex problems get reduced to slogans, difficult trade-offs get ignored. And when reality intrudes, officials blame complexity rather than acknowledging mistakes. As I watched the hearing footage again, Pocan's final statement echoed in my mind. Consumers pay Trump's tariff tax. That's the reality. 4 words that cut through months of obfuscation. That's the reality. Not the political reality, not the messaging reality, not the investor conference reality, just mathematics, supply and demand, cause and effect, the economic reality that families live with every time they buy groceries, fill their cars with gas, or try to keep small businesses afloat, because ultimately that's what economic policy is supposed to serve. Not political narratives or investor sentiment, but the basic mathematical relationship between policies and the people they affect. When we lose sight of that connection, we lose everything that makes public service worthwhile.